Good morning. Today is Tuesday, May 5th, Tuesday, April 5th. What we're doing is we're looking at the book of Exodus, chapter number 3. And we're reading Exodus chapter number 3, verse number 1 through chapter 4, verse 19. Exodus 3, 1 through 4:19. And what this chapter talks about, it refers to Moses, and when he was called by God. What took place is he was raised in the Egyptian court. 40 years he lived there. And if you remember, what took place is he murdered an Egyptian, defending another Israelite. That was found out. It was made public, and he ran away. And he decided to make another life out in the wilderness in the land of Midian. And he was there for 40 years. And one day when he was watching his father-in-law's flock, he was watching over his sheep, he saw something in the distance on the mountain. And this is where we talked about where you see about the burning bush. Moses sees a bush burning. And ultimately what happens is he goes to it, and God calls him back to Egypt to pull all of the Israelites out of the land of Egypt. Now here's the thing. What we're going to do is we're going to focus on one main thing for every single day that we're going to talk about. If you remember with Joseph, we talked about preparation. Even in the midst of all the difficulties and the circumstances that Joseph was in when he was in prison, God was preparing him. Today what we're going to do is we're going to talk about a very important topic called willingness. We see that Moses, honestly, in the initial part of this story, we see that Moses was not willing. Moses was not willing to go. What took place is Moses sees a burning bush, and may or may not have been out of the ordinary. And as he sees this burning bush, normally what takes place is it eventually goes out. But what was unique about this bush is the Bible doesn't say how much time passed, but time passed. It could have been minutes, it could have been hours, or it could have been even half a day, where he realized, I wonder why this bush is continuously burning. Ultimately, what happens is something burns up and fire moves on, or it just stops. But this bush kept burning and burning and burning, and it didn't stop. And so it piqued Moses' curiosity. He climbed up there, and suddenly when he was there, the bush began to speak to him. And ultimately, that bush asked him, said, this is the Lord, and I want you to go back to Egypt, and I want you to take everybody out, all of the Israelites out of the land of Egypt to the place that I'm going to show you, to the promised land. Well, Moses was at first, he wasn't willing. And to be honest with you, I think there was a little bit of fear there. There was a little bit of fear, not necessarily unwillingness, even though that may have been in the back of his mind. He began to give God excuses. And many times when we're asked to do something spiritual, when we're asked to do something, even just the normal responsibilities, chores of the day, what takes place is we give excuses. When we talk about the book of Proverbs, we mentioned about individuals, the slothful individual, the sluggard, is that individual who constantly gives excuses, constantly looks for reasons not to do what they're supposed to do. As a matter of fact, they many times spend more time working, or they spend more effort trying to get out of what they're supposed to do than just simply doing what they're supposed to do. If they just did what they're supposed to do, it'd be a whole lot easier for them. I've said this before, I'll continue to say it again, life is always easier when you just obey. And we see Moses had to go through a series of different things, and God tells Moses some different things throughout this. He gives them excuses. He tells them, well, God, I don't know what your name is. God tells him what his name is. He continues to go on and says, they won't believe me. He goes on to say also, who am I? Who am I? They won't believe me. He gives all of these excuses. And he tells them also, he says, I can't speak. I got to stutter. He says, don't worry about it. Aaron, your brother, will speak for you. He will help you. And God, with every single excuse or every single reason, supposedly, that Moses came up with, God gives him an answer for that. And many times God does the same thing in our own lives. What happens is we many times tell God that we can't do something, or we're not, it's difficult for us to do something. And what God does is many times he shows us different things, and he says, hey, no, yeah, you can. Look at this. Look, all you got to do is trust me. Look at this. All you got to do is continue going in this direction. You just got to keep doing this. And God gives us answers for our excuses. And what it ultimately boils down to is are we truly willing to do what God has called us to do? Willingness. Willingness. We need to make sure that we're willing to do that. And sometimes there's difficulty with this. Many times in the New Testament, the Apostle Paul says, the spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak. The spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak. We need to make sure that we discipline our flesh, we have control over our flesh, and the only way that we can do that is being spirit-led by the Word of God. Even Jesus Christ, when he was going to the cross, and granted, that was something way more difficult than we've been asked to do, but we see that he even struggled with this with willingness, and he prayed to the Lord in the Garden of Gethsemane, not my will, but thy will be done. Willingness. Willingness is something that is important. Something that we need to make sure that that we line up our lives with what God would have us to do, and we need to be willing to do it. Now, sometimes, I'll be honest with you, vast majority of times, God doesn't ask us to do something extreme. What God does is, God sees where we are at spiritually, and what he does is he takes and he wants us to push us just to the next level. And once we get to that level, what God says, okay, I want you to continue to go to the next level. Continue to go to the next level. What he does is he wants us to continuously go forward. Continuously made forward movement, progressive movement. And we need to be willing to do that. Many times what it is just through a series of steps of obedience. You can see in the Old Testament how many individuals, many different examples where God just simply asked people to do something and they did it. And what they did is they ultimately walked by faith. And that faith was manifested, it was revealed, it was shown by their obedience to God. The obedience to God. Abraham, when God asked him to go to a land that he will show you, Abraham just went ahead and did. Abraham, again, when he was asked to continuously, through a series of different measures, he was asked to sacrifice his son, and Abraham went ahead and did it. He went ahead and made that decision, conscious decision to do what was asked of him. We need to make sure that we're willing to do that. Sometimes we'll have excuses, sometimes we'll have reasons, but you know what? God's going to eliminate those excuses. He's going to get rid of those reasons, and he's going to say, now what? Are you truly willing to do this? Because I've removed those obstacles from your life. Where is your heart? And ultimately, that's what God did with Moses. God got him to the point where he said, I want to see your heart and see if you're actually willing. And to be honest with you, Moses was, those reasons that he had were really excuses to come up with different reasons why he shouldn't do what God called him to do. But ultimately, God says, you're doing this. Don't be afraid. I'm going to be with you. I'm going to send Moses, and you're going to do this. You can even see that a little bit in verse number 14 of chapter number 4, where God says, you're going to do this, and because I've called you to do this, now go and do it. Hopefully we get to the point where when God asks us to do something, we just simply do it. Life is always easier when you just obey. The reason why many times individuals in authority are maybe harsh is the right word, I don't know, harsh is the right word, are forward, or making sure that you fulfill the responsibilities and do the things that you're supposed to do, that this is what you need to understand, is that if you cannot obey someone you can see, how much more difficult is it going to be to obey someone you can't see? If you can't even obey your parents, obey your teachers, obey those in authority over you, then how much more difficult is it going to be to obey God, who you can't see? See, what happens is those in authority and those who are instructing you are teaching you, so that way when someone you can see teaches you to obey, so that way when someone who you can't see tells you to do something, you do it without hesitation. Our job as teachers, our job as parents, is to instruct you, to help you, to say when God asks you to do something, you do it right away without hesitation. When the Holy Spirit prompts you to do something, you do it right away without hesitation. And you need to make sure that you have a willingness to do something, because you never know what great of a thing that God has for you as long as you're willing. Moses ultimately became willing, and he led all of the nation of Israel out of Egypt. Moses was described as the meekest person in the Bible. None of that probably would have taken place if he had not done what God asked him to do. God has something great for you. God has something spectacular. He has something that only you can accomplish. But you know what? You have to be willing to do it. You have to have a willingness. Go ahead and read through this passage and think about that. Think about that concept of willingness, and make sure as we go throughout our lives and go through our week and our day that we say, you know what, God, I'm willing to do what you have asked me to do. Have a good day.